Let's now bring on a very special guest who is joining us. Taffy Howard is with us. She's chair of the U.S. term limits in the great state of South Dakota. And Taffy, how are you? Good morning.
I'm doing great. Thanks so much, Jeff, for having me on. It's a pleasure.
Before we get into a little bit about the issue, tell us about U.S. term limits, if you could.
Well, term limits is something that is overwhelmingly supported by the American people. More than 82% of Americans support it. It's bipartisan, which politicians, you can't get any better than that, supporting something that is supported by everyone across the spectrum. But as you know, politicians don't want to be term limited for the most part. They love the power. They love being able to control our lives. So they are fighting it, but we are making progress. And we have right now in Congress, we have Representative Ralph Norman of South Carolina that has a resolution in the House. He has 96 co-sponsors. Sadly, our representative from South Dakota is not one of them. Doesn't surprise me, but and then in the Senate, Ted Cruz has one, and I think he has 16 co-sponsors. And again, South Dakota, sadly, is lacking in supporting that, which is abhorrent because the people of South Dakota overwhelmingly do support this.
Well, I mean, the people all over the country, right, Taffy? I mean, this is something that is
Exactly.
broadly supported by Democrats and Republicans, right? I mean, this is one of the few things that
Absolutely.
brings people together, right? Term limits.
Absolutely. And there's so many benefits to term limits. You know, there's been research. So our state does have term limits on the legislature, and several states, I think roughly 15 states do. But I found it interesting. The Mercatus Center evaluates all 50 states by their financial condition. And out of the top 5 states, and I have to brag, South Dakota's number 2, out of the top 5 states, 4 of those have term limits on their legislatures. Of the bottom states, none of them do. So term limits benefit us financially. They benefit us by giving us turnover and getting rid of, people say they want to drain the swamp. Well, there's no better way to drain the swamp than to enact term limits. In the last presidential election, go ahead.
Yeah. No, I was going to say, why don't you finish your point, and then I've got something to ask you. Go ahead. What happened in the last election?
So in the last election, 100% of the senators that ran for re-election, the incumbents, won, and more than 98% of the representatives. And I don't know if you probably know, I challenged Dusty in the last election. I am a conservative who votes based on those principles. He's a squishy rhino. But so I know from experience how incredibly difficult it is for a challenger to unseat an incumbent.
Right.
They have so many advantages. They have the fundraising advantage. They can use their frank mail privilege to, my constituents across the state would receive mailings from my opponent. And it didn't mention me, so it technically wasn't considered campaign literature. So the taxpayers were paying for that.
And that's just wrong. And, you're right. So the incumbents have the advantage of, so they've got universal name recognition. They have all the money. They've got the, of course, privileges, so they can command attention whenever they say something. They can skip debates out. They have all these special interests and donors that fund their campaigns. So it's impossible, extremely difficult to beat an incumbent. So people say, oh, yeah, we have term limits. We have elections every 2 years and 4 years. Theoretically, that's true.
Right.
But in reality, it is not.
Right.
And, another aspect to this is that, the critics say, well, hey, if you turn over people, then the bureaucrats, the people that run these agencies and departments, are going to give them more power because they'll know how to run things, and all these newbies up there will be at their disposal. I think we also should put these bureaucrats on term limits. I don't think people like Anthony Fauci should be at a department for 50 years, Taffy.
I would absolutely love that. And so I served in the state legislature as well. And so I would say, though, that having new people come in, it keeps the bureaucrats on their toes. Because I know when I went in, I mean, there were about 3 of us on appropriations that we started holding the bureaucrats' feet to the fire. It was the politicians who had been there year after year after year that didn't want to challenge the bureaucrats. They'd made friends with them. So it was all one big, the good old boys club. So it's the newcomers that are willing to push and to challenge and to change. And that's what we need. And so I do get the argument. People go, well, somebody asked me the other day, they said, who are some of the people that you do like in Congress? And I said, well, I like Thomas Massey, Andy Biggs, Matt Gaetz. Those are some of the ones I respect. Rand Paul, Jim Jordan. And they said, well, term limits would get rid of them as well. And I said, well, first of all, no one should think that they're not replaceable, that they are so great at what they're doing that they can't be replaced. That goes for all of them. And they better be training up the next generation to replace them if they're doing their job. And I'd rather get rid of 300 bad apples and yes, have to get rid of one or two good ones in order to get that turnover that we need in Congress.
You look at the people that are giving us the worst problems. Mitch McConnell, he's been there forever. Chuck Schumer, he's been there forever. You look at the other side, Nancy Pelosi, she's been there forever. So these are people that go up there, they stay, they make it a career, they become beholden to the special interests. And you know what also they do? They get rich off of the taxpayers. And how do all these public servants leave office with mansions? Because they've been up there forever, and they have all these deals. So we got to get rid of them. The founders, I think, they didn't envision a country where people would go up there and stay for decades and stay when they're in a wheelchair and stay when they're 89 and, 90 and die in the hall of Congress at 95. I mean, can you imagine? They didn't envision that, did they?
It is absolutely crazy. And I think of like Pelosi, I was just looking her up to see, I wanted to know exactly how many years she'd been in there. And it's 36 years that she's been in there. But I look at those people and just from a personal perspective, I go, why aren't you enjoying time with your grandkids? And by now, great grandkids. I mean, but they are so addicted to the power. And that's what it's all about. It's all about money and power. And it's up to the people to take that from them because they won't do it themselves.
I agree. We have a few minutes left, and I want to ask you some important questions. One, Taffy, is where does this resolution stand? Don't we need a certain number of states to force an amendment on the ballot? Doesn't this need to be a constitutional amendment? Fill us in on that.
So we do need 34 states to pass the same resolution with the same call, as you will, the same language, calling for term limits. And we have 6 states that have actually passed it. We're active in 14 more states. So we're going to get there. It's just going to take a little bit of time. I have confidence that South Dakota will be one of the next states to pass that. So we need 34 states to pass that. Then that will force Congress to call a constitutional convention to consider that resolution.
What about Convention of States? Are you working with Convention of States? Because isn't one of their action items term limits?
It is, but they have several other action items, and so that is the difference. They have a couple of broader calls in theirs, like limiting the power of the federal government, which is great, but ours is very focused on term limits. And we aren't getting involved in the other issues.
Where does Louisiana stand? Are we one of the 6 states that has passed this resolution? And if not, why not?
Well, that I don't know. Louisiana is not one of the states that has passed it so far.
Okay.
So I cannot tell you why. I would think Louisiana would have no problem passing that. I would think no state would have a problem passing it. But again, you're fighting politicians.
Yeah. So actually, they enacted term limits on themselves. There are term limits in the Louisiana legislature. There's a 3-term limit of 12 years, and that's all they can serve. Then they have to get out. And some of them, go to the other house. But, at least they get out of the position they're in, at least give you some turnover.
Right. I would ask, though, did they enact it on themselves, or was it like in South Dakota when it was initiated by the people? So
it was actually enacted. They actually enacted it on themselves, believe it or not.
Wow,
believe it or not.
That is amazing.
That is absolutely. And we've got a measure right now that we're working on, HB 212, which will make it easier to recall them. So if they pass that, then they're going to make it easier for people to kick them out of office if they do the wrong thing. So that'll be another amazing thing if we can get that bill passed. So
that will be.
All right.
So,
So Taffy, in the final minute or so here, where can our listeners get more information? How can they help with this issue?
we'll go on to U.S. term limits online. We also have a weekly podcast, the No Uncertain Terms podcast, so they can listen to that and get some updates on there and sometimes some humorous stories concerning politicians trying to protect their own butts. But so go online. You can make contributions. You can sign the petition, show your support that way, listen to the podcast, and call your state congressman and tell them to sign on as co-sponsors to the resolutions in Congress.
And in our final few seconds, didn't Kevin McCarthy agree in his deal with the conservatives to become speaker that he was going to allow a vote on term limits? Wasn't that part of the agreement?
That's what I understand. So, yeah,
where's that vote?
Too many kudos to
Where's the vote?
Where is the vote? I don't know. Hopefully it will be coming, but that's another thing. Hold McCarthy's feet to the fire. You know, politicians do pay attention.
He's a rhino.
Yeah. I know.
He's a rhino. All right. Taffy, we'll do it again, okay? We'll do it again,
you.
but we got to roll
Thank
right
you,
now. Thanks so much
All right,
for being
take
with
care.
us. Taffy Howard with us, South Dakota chair for U.S. term limits.